The air in Aurelia was not merely air, it was a curated atmosphere, a heavy, gilded substance that smelled of old money, truffles, and the subtle floral notes of perfumes that cost more than a month's rent. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, shattering into 1,000 diamonds on the polished silverware and the deep, dark mahogany of the walls. It was a cathedral of wealth, where conversations were conducted in hushed conspiratorial tones, the gentle clinking of forks against porcelain, the only percussion to the silent orchestration of power. Every surface gleamed with a low, confident light, from the velvet of the high-backed chairs to the flawlessly clear crystal of the wineglasses. The patrons were as much a part of the decor as the art on the walls, their faces smooth with privilege, their movements languid and assured. They were titans of industry, heirs to fortunes, and the beautiful people who orbited them, all playing their part in the grand theater of the 1%. This was a world unto itself, a golden sanctuary, sealed off from the grit and struggle of the city outside, a place where $1,000 bottle of wine was an afterthought, and the destinies of entire companies could be decided over dessert. Into this opulent theater moved Elena Vance, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. She was an embodiment of professional invisibility, her movements so fluid and practiced that she could clear a table or refill a water glass without causing the slightest ripple in the patrons' conversations. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, functional bun, and her face was a mask of pleasant neutrality, her eyes revealing nothing of the storm that raged perpetually behind them. To the diners, she was simply a pair of hands, an extension of the restaurant's impeccable service, as inanimate as the salt shaker on the table. But beneath the starched fabric of her uniform, a different person existed entirely. Her mind, currently occupied with memorizing the evening's specials and ensuring the bread baskets were warm, was a fortress of legal knowledge, a mind that had graduated top of its class from Yale Law. Her hands, now carefully polishing a wine glass until it squeaked, were the same hands that had once drafted the foundational legal architecture for corporate empires. She was living a dual existence, her brilliant past meticulously buried beneath the mundane reality of her present, a present she endured with a silent, iron-willed resolve. Her resolve was forged not in ambition, but in the sterile, quiet halls of a long-term care facility miles away from the decadent splendor of Aurelia. The image of her father was seared into the back of her mind, a constant, silent presence that fueled her every waking moment. He had been a judge, a man of unshakable integrity and booming laughter, his presence filling every room he entered. Now he was a shadow of that man, confined to a hospital bed, his brilliant mind trapped in a body ravaged by a massive stroke. The doctors had been clear. The stroke was brought on by extreme stress, a direct result of the public scandal that had destroyed his daughter's life. The memory of that time was a raw, open wound. Julian's betrayal had not just cost Elena her career and her reputation, it had shattered her family, silencing the one voice that had always been her greatest champion. So she worked, enduring the aches in her feet and the condescension in the eyes of the wealthy, because every meager tip, every dollar from her paycheck, was a lifeline for her father. It paid for the 24/7 care, the specialized treatments, the faint hope that one day he might speak her name again. This was not a job, it was an act of devotion, a quiet war waged one table at a time. The delicate balance of the room shifted when Julian Croft entered. He did not simply arrive. He made an entrance, the air crackling with his presence, as if the restaurant itself recognized a predator in its midst. The maîtresse d', a man known for his unflappable composure, practically bowed as he led Julian to the best table in the house, a secluded corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the entire floor. Julian moved with the easy, predatory grace of a man who had never been told no, his custom-tailored suit fitting him like a second skin, a ridiculously expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. Elena felt his arrival like a drop in barometric pressure. A cold, familiar dread coiled in her stomach. and she had to consciously steady her hands, forcing her breathing to remain slow and even. She kept her head down, her focus trained on a table across the room, praying to go unnoticed. She could feel his gaze sweep over the staff, a dismissive, proprietary glance that assessed and discarded them in a single, arrogant blink. He was the architect of her ruin, the man she had once loved with every fiber of her being, and now he sat less than 30 feet away, radiating a power that was built on the ashes of her life. He was not alone. Trailing in his wake was a young woman, Tiffany, whose beauty was as loud and obvious as Julian's suit. She was impossibly thin, draped in a designer dress that shimmered under the chandeliers, her laughter high and brittle as she clung to his arm. She was a perfect trophy, a living testament to his success and virility. They settled into the booth, and Julian immediately began holding court, his voice a low, confident rumble that was just loud enough to be overheard by the surrounding tables. He spoke of a recent hostile takeover, a predatory merger, as the financial papers had called it, but he described it with the detached glee of a hunter recounting a successful kill. Elena watched them from the periphery, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She saw the way Tiffany looked at him, with a mixture of adoration and awe, the same way she herself had once looked at him, before she had seen the rot beneath the charming facade. The sight was a fresh twist of the knife, a painful reminder of her own naivete, of the life and the love she had believed in, only to have it all revealed as a meticulously crafted lie. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor, forcing her to serve the man who had destroyed her world. As Elena approached their table to pour their water, her movements were mechanical, her face an impassive mask. She kept her eyes fixed on the glasses, avoiding any possibility of eye contact. It was Tiffany who spoke first, her voice laced with a casual, thoughtless curiosity. She tilted her head, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowed slightly as she looked at Elena. "You know," she said to Julian, her voice carrying across the table, "it's strange. She looks so familiar." The words hung in the air, a spotlight of unwanted attention. Elena's entire body went rigid. 1,000 memories flooded her mind. Images of her and Julian at charity galas, their wedding photos in society magazines, the press conferences where she had stood proudly by his side. Of course she looked familiar. She was the woman whose face had been plastered next to his for years, the woman he had erased from his history. Inside her head, a voice screamed with a fury she could not express, a torrent of unspoken truths and bitter accusations that churned like a violent sea. On the outside, however, she did not flinch, her hand remaining perfectly steady as she finished pouring the water, her professionalism and armor against the sudden, brutal assault of the past. Julian didn't even bother to look at Elena. He let out a soft, condescending chuckle, a sound that grated on Elena's nerves like scraping metal. He waved a dismissive hand in her direction as if shooing away an insect. "Darling," he said, his voice dripping with amused contempt, "we don't know service staff." The words were a physical blow, more painful than any slap. It was a complete and utter negation of her existence, of their shared history, of the love and life they had built together. Tiffany giggled, a vapid, tinkling sound that echoed Julian's cruelty. In that single moment, Elena was not a person. She was a piece of furniture, an object unworthy of a second glance. A glacial fury began to solidify in her veins, a cold, clarifying rage that burned away the despair and left behind something hard and sharp. The humiliation was absolute, a public stripping away of her identity. He didn't just not recognize her, he refused to. He had buried her so deep in his past that he could look right through her, and the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was the final spark that lit a long, dormant fuse within her soul. The waitress was gone, and in her place stood the lawyer, the wife, the woman he had wronged so terribly. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. High on his own performance, eager to further impress his young date with his intellect and power, Julian leaned forward conspiratorially. He began to speak about the very deal he had been celebrating, lowering his voice just enough to make it seem exclusive, yet still loud enough for Elena, standing just a few feet away, to hear every single word. He started dropping names of shell corporations and outlining the complex legal maneuvers he had used to bypass regulations. He spoke of loopholes, of jurisdictional arbitrage, of financial instruments so complex they were designed to be opaque. And as he spoke, a profound and dangerous shift occurred within Elena. The cold rage transformed into a laser-like focus. She was no longer just listening. She was analyzing, her mind moving with the swift, incisive precision that had once made her a legal prodigy. He was discussing the very corporate structure she had designed for him years ago, but he was describing a perversion of it, a weaponization of the safeguards she had put in place. He was boasting about the very vulnerabilities she had warned him against, the ethical lines she had told him never to cross. In his monumental hubris, he was handing her the exact weapons she would need, completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible waitress at his side was the one person on Earth who knew exactly how to dismantle his entire corrupt empire, piece by piece. For a long, suspended moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The ambient murmur of Aurelia, the soft symphony of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, did not so much fade as it was forcibly silenced by a new, dominant frequency. This frequency emanated from Elena. It was the silent hum of a high-voltage line, a sudden and palpable shift in the room's energy that drew eyes away from their plates and their companions. The waitress, once a mere fixture of the background, had become the undeniable center of gravity. The cold, clarifying rage that had frozen her veins now began to thaw, not into heat, but into a current of pure, focused power. Her mind, a caged eagle for so long, was now soaring, mapping the terrain of the battlefield Julian had so foolishly laid out before her. Every boastful word he had spoken about his deal, every mention of a shell company, every hint of a legal shortcut, was now a glowing node on a strategic map inside her head. He had handed her the blueprints to his own destruction, wrapped in the ribbon of his contempt. The image of her father, frail and silent in his hospital bed, flickered behind her eyes, not as a source of pain, but as a sharpening stone for her resolve. This was no longer about survival. This was about reclamation. A subtle but profound transformation began in her physical being, a change so complete it was as if she were shedding an ill-fitting skin. Her posture, once a study in professional deference, straightened with an almost audible click. Her shoulders, which had been slightly hunched from years of carrying trays and invisible burdens, squared themselves, creating a silhouette of authority. The pleasant, neutral mask she wore dissolved, and the true architecture of her face emerged, the high cheekbones, the determined set of her jaw, the piercing intelligence in her dark eyes. The waitress was gone, exorcised by the sheer force of her will. In her place stood Elena Vance, Juris Doctor, Yale Law, summa cum laude. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms with the quiet confidence of her intellect was reawakening, and the very air around her seemed to thin, to sharpen, crackling with an unspoken warning. She was no longer serving, she was preparing to adjudicate. The simple black uniform she wore seemed to transform with her, no longer a symbol of servitude, but the severe, simple robes of a judge about to pass sentence. Her hands, which had been steady in their menial tasks, were now imbued with a different kind of stillness, the stillness of a surgeon before the first incision. She began to move. Each step was a deliberate, measured beat against the polished marble floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, cavernous silence of the restaurant. She did not hurry. Her pace was that of a queen approaching a throne, or a prosecutor approaching the witness stand. She moved with an unnerving grace, her eyes locked on Julian, and on Julian alone. The other diners, the opulent room, the glittering chandeliers, they all ceased to exist, fading into a muted, irrelevant periphery. There was only the path between her and the man who had authored her ruin. As she drew closer, she could see the first flicker of confusion in his eyes, the slight furrowing of his brow as he tried to process this sudden, inexplicable shift in his reality. The waitress was not behaving as a waitress should. She was not averting her gaze. She was not disappearing. Instead, she was advancing, her presence growing larger, more formidable, with every single step. He was a predator who had just realized, with a jolt of primal fear, that the prey he had been toying with was, in fact, a far more dangerous hunter than he could have ever imagined. The power he wielded, the power of money and influence, felt suddenly flimsy and inadequate against the ancient, unyielding force that was now walking toward him. She stopped at the edge of his table, a silent, imposing figure, and then she lifted her head and met his gaze. The connection was electric, a circuit completed after years of being broken. In that instant, Julian Croft saw her. He truly saw her, not as a piece of service staff, not as a vague, familiar face, but as Elena. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the air from his lungs. His smug, condescending smile didn't just fade, it collapsed, melting from his face as if the muscles beneath had suddenly turned to liquid. His skin, moments before flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, turned a ghastly, ashen white. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated terror. He saw the ghost of his past, the woman he had tried to erase, standing before him, not broken and defeated, but radiating a calm, terrifying power he had never seen in her before. All the lies he had built his life upon, all the secrets he had buried, were suddenly unearthed, staring back at him from the depths of her unwavering eyes. The nameplate on her uniform might have said Elena, but her gaze screamed a different name: Consequence. The restaurant was so quiet you could hear the frantic, panicked beat of Julian's heart. Elena let the silence stretch, letting him drown in the horror of his own recognition. She watched the sweat bead on his forehead, saw the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his hand as it rested on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that cut through the thick, tense air like a scalpel. It was a voice devoid of the rage and pain that had been her constant companions for years. Instead, it was calm, measured, and lethally precise. It was the voice of a lawyer making her closing argument, a statement of fact from which there was no appeal. She looked from Julian's terrified face to Tiffany's confused and slightly annoyed expression, and then back to Julian. "She doesn't know I'm still your wife, does she?" The question was not an accusation, it was a verdict. It landed in the center of the table with the devastating weight of a granite block, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of Julian's life into a million irreparable pieces. Each word was perfectly enunciated, a testament to years of legal training, each syllable a hammer blow against the foundation of his corrupt empire. The aftermath was immediate and catastrophic. Tiffany let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, her manicured hand flying to her mouth as her brain struggled to connect the words she just heard with the powerful, successful man sitting beside her. A fork clattered from the hand of a diner at a nearby table, the sharp metallic sound an exclamation point to the drama unfolding. But all eyes were on Julian. The last vestiges of color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. He made a strange, guttural sound, a half-choked gasp for air that wasn't there. His body, which had been a monument to arrogant confidence just moments before, seemed to deflate. He collapsed backward into the plush velvet of the booth, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, his gaze fixed on Elena with an expression of pure, primal dread. The Titan had fallen. The master of the universe had been reduced to a cornered, frightened man, exposed and utterly poleaxed in his own sanctuary. In that single perfectly delivered sentence, Elena had done more than reveal a secret. She had executed a flawless coup, seizing control of the narrative, the room, and the rest of Julian Croft's life. The power dynamic had not just shifted, It had been completely and irrevocably inverted. For several long, agonizing seconds, Julian remained frozen, a statue of impotent shock. But then, the paralysis broke, shattered by a surge of pure, narcissistic fury. Humiliation was a poison he could not tolerate, and public humiliation was a fate worse than death. A dark, mottled flush crept up his neck and spread across his face, a stark contrast to the deathly pallor of moments before. His jaw worked silently, his teeth grinding with an audible crunch. This was not the calculated anger of a powerful man. This was the blind, sputtering rage of a child whose favorite toy had just been broken. He had been exposed, made to look weak in front of his new conquest, in front of his peers, in front of the very world he had spent his life dominating. And it had been done by her, the woman he had discarded, the woman he had deemed nothing. The sheer audacity of it, the sheer impossibility of it, stoked the flames of his rage into a raging inferno. He had to regain control, to reassert his dominance, to crush this insect who had dared to sting him. He would not be undone by a waitress. With a visible effort, Julian pulled himself upright, his movements stiff and jerky. He avoided looking at Elena, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an ally, but finding only the rapt, curious faces of the other diners. His eyes finally landed on the maitre d', Monsieur Dubois, who was hovering nervously near the entrance, his face a mask of professional anxiety. Julian raised a trembling hand and crooked a single, imperious finger. "Dubois," he bellowed, his voice raw and strained, a far cry from its usual confident rumble. The name echoed through the dining room, a command that could not be ignored. Monsieur Dubois scurried to the table, his face pale, his posture one of complete subservience. He knew, as everyone in Aurelia knew, that Julian Croft was not just a patron, he was a lifeline. His corporate accounts, his lavish parties, his constant stream of high-powered guests accounted for a significant portion of the restaurant's revenue. To displease Julian Croft was to risk financial ruin, a fact that Julian was now preparing to leverage with brutal efficiency. He was a wounded animal, and he was about to lash out at the nearest, softest target. Monsieur Dubois arrived at the table, his eyes flicking nervously between Julian's enraged face and Elena's unnervingly calm demeanor. "Monsieur Croft," he began, his voice a low, placating murmur, "is there a problem with the service?" Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. He finally turned his gaze on Elena, and the contempt in his eyes was so potent it was almost a physical force. He pointed a shaking finger at her, his hand just inches from her face. "A problem?" he spat, the words dripping with venom. "This thing has insulted my guest. She has disrupted my dinner. She has created a scene in your fine establishment." He paused, letting the weight of his unspoken threat hang in the air. He leaned closer to the terrified manager, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, menacing hiss that was still audible to everyone nearby. "I want her gone. Not just from this table, not just from this room. I want her out of this building. I want her fired, now. Or you can be sure that my associates and I will be taking our business elsewhere permanently." The ultimatum was delivered with the cold, final certainty of a guillotine's blade. Monsieur Dubois' professional composure crumbled. He was trapped, caught between the unwritten rules of human decency and the brutal calculus of commerce. He looked at Elena, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a flicker of genuine apology in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement of the gross injustice he was about to perpetrate, but it was just a flicker. Fear, cold and pragmatic, quickly extinguished it. He could not afford to defy Julian Croft. He turned to Elena, his face a miserable mask of regret. "Elena," he said, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, unable to meet her eyes. "Please, gather your things from the locker room. Your services are no longer required." The words were formal, hollow, the sterile language of corporate cowardice. It was a pathetic, gutless surrender, and it was exactly what Julian wanted. He wanted to see her stripped of her livelihood, cast out into the street, to prove to himself and to everyone watching that he was still in control, that he still had the power to destroy her. He needed to re-establish the order of his universe, where he was the sun and she was nothing more than a speck of dust. Elena did not flinch. She did not plead or argue. She simply gave Monsieur Dubois a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. The job had already served its purpose. It had placed her in the right room at the right time. It was a means to an end, and that end had now been reached. With a quiet dignity that seemed to amplify Julian's boorish rage, she turned to leave. But Julian wasn't finished. He needed one last act of cruelty. One final assertion of his dominance. He surged to his feet and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. He spun her around to face him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour against her cheek, his voice a low, venomous whisper meant only for her. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think this changes anything?" he hissed, spittle flying from his lips. "You are nothing. You have nothing. I destroyed you once, and I swear to you, I will do it again. I will bury you so deep no one will ever find a trace of you. You will regret this for the rest of your miserable life." For the first time that evening, a flicker of emotion crossed Elena's face. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something that looked almost like pity. She held his gaze, her own eyes as cold and clear as a winter sky. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was more powerful than any threat he could utter. It was the silence of absolute certainty. It told him that the game had changed, that the rules he had always played by no longer applied. It told him that he had made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. He had mistaken her patience for weakness, her silence for surrender. He had underestimated the woman he had wronged the most, and now he would pay the price. She gently but firmly pulled her arm from his grasp. His hand fell away, as if it had been burned. Without another glance at him, or at the stunned and silent dining room, she turned and walked away. Her steps were not those of a fired waitress, but of a general leaving a battlefield after securing a decisive, strategic victory. The war was far from over, but the first, most critical battle had just been won. The walk out of Aurelia was a journey between worlds. She moved from the gilded cage of opulence, with its hushed tones and scent of truffles, through the swinging doors of the kitchen, a chaotic inferno of clattering pans and shouted orders, and finally, out into the cold, damp embrace of the city night. The frigid air hit her face like a slap, a stark and welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant. It smelled of wet pavement, exhaust fumes, and the endless striving energy of New York. The transition was jarring, a sudden plunge from a dream of wealth into the hard, unforgiving reality of her existence. As she walked toward the subway station, the adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, leaving a hollow, trembling void in its place. The weight of her actions, the sheer, terrifying audacity of what she had just done, came crashing down on her. She had just lost her job. Her only source of income, the fragile lifeline that kept her father alive, had been severed by the very man who had put him in that hospital bed in the first place. A wave of panic, cold and sickening, washed over her. The subway car was a cacophony of screeching metal and flickering fluorescent lights, a stark, grimy counterpoint to the chandelier-lit splendor she had just left. She sank onto a hard plastic seat, surrounded by the tired, anonymous faces of the city's late-night commuters. Here she was invisible again, but this time the invisibility felt different. It was not the professional invisibility of a waitress, but the crushing anonymity of the powerless. She stared at her own reflection in the darkened window, a pale, ghostly image superimposed over the rushing blackness of the tunnel. For a terrifying moment, Julian's words echoed in her mind. "You are nothing. You have nothing." Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in the pit of her stomach. What had she really accomplished? A moment of satisfying drama? A brief, fleeting victory that had cost her everything? The practical, desperate reality of her situation began to set in. The next payment for her father's care facility was due in 2 weeks. It was a sum of over $10,000. Without her job, she had no way to pay it. The thought was a physical pain, a tightening in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She finally arrived at her apartment, a small, sparse one-bedroom in a walk-up building in Queens that was a universe away from the Park Avenue penthouse she had once shared with Julian. The silence of the small space was deafening. The air was cool and smelled faintly of dust and the lemon-scented cleaner she used on the floors. A stack of bills sat on the small kitchen counter, a silent, menacing monument to her financial precarity. Medical statements, utility notices, the rent bill. Each envelope was a reminder of her desperate struggle, a paper cut on her already wounded soul. She walked over to the counter and picked up the top envelope, the one from the long-term care facility. She ran her thumb over the embossed logo, her heart aching with a familiar blend of love and despair. For a moment, she allowed the full weight of her exhaustion to wash over her. The years of physical toil, the emotional strain of her father's condition, the constant, grinding humiliation of her daily life. It was all too much. She leaned against the counter, her head bowed, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the hot, stinging prick of tears behind her eyes. But she did not cry. Instead, she took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another. The moment of despair passed, burned away by the still smoldering embers of her resolve. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. Surrender was not an option. Julian was wrong. She was not nothing. She was the daughter of Judge Robert Vance, a man who had taught her that the law was not just a profession, but a shield for the innocent and a sword against the corrupt. She walked over to a small, framed photograph on her bookshelf. It showed her father in his judicial robes, his face radiating wisdom and kindness, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a smile. She looked at that photo, at the man who had given her everything, the man for whom she was fighting, and the cold fury from the restaurant returned. But it was different now. It was no longer a spontaneous reaction to an insult. It was a cold, deliberate, and focused instrument of war. She would not be buried. She would be the one holding the shovel. The time for passive endurance was over. The time for strategic, methodical, and ruthless action had begun. Her entire demeanor shifted. The exhaustion fell away, replaced by a surge of focused energy. She walked with a newfound purpose to the back of her cramped closet, past the few simple outfits she owned, and the single black waitress uniform hanging like a shed skin. In the very back, buried under a stack of old blankets, was a heavy, dust-covered leather briefcase. It was a relic from her former life, the one object she had kept from the wreckage. She pulled it out, the scent of old leather and paper filling the air, a fragrance that was more her own than any perfume she had ever worn. She placed it on her small coffee table and clicked open the 2 brass latches. The sound was crisp and final, the opening of a tomb or the chambering of a round. Inside, preserved like ancient artifacts, were the tools of her true trade. A well-worn copy of the Restatement of the Law of Contracts, her old notebooks from Yale filled with her precise, elegant script, and at the very bottom, her diploma, the name Elena Vance, printed in elegant, embossed calligraphy. She ran her fingers over the familiar objects, and it felt like coming home. It was a reunion with the person she was always meant to be. She knew she could not do this alone. Julian was a formidable enemy, protected by a fortress of high-priced lawyers, corrupt accountants, and powerful connections. To attack him head-on would be suicide. She needed a guide, a mentor, someone who understood the battlefield and could help her navigate its treacherous terrain. Her mind immediately landed on one name, Alistair Finch. He had been her favorite professor at Yale, a titan of corporate ethics who had later been appointed as a federal judge. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity, a close friend and colleague of her father's, and one of the few people who had reached out to her after her disbarment, offering not pity, but a quiet, steadfast belief in her innocence. She hadn't spoken to him in years, too ashamed to burden him with her fallen state, but shame was another luxury she could no longer afford. She rummaged through an old address book, her fingers tracing the faded ink until she found his private number. Her hand trembled as she picked up her phone, the weight of this single call feeling immense. This was the point of no return. This was the moment she officially declared war. Taking one last, deep breath to steady her nerves, she dialed the number. It rang 3 times, each ring echoing the frantic beating of her own heart. Then, a deep, familiar voice answered, crisp and alert even late at night. Finch. Her own voice was a hoarse whisper at first, barely audible. Judge Finch? It's Elena. Elena Vance. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of silence that stretched for an eternity. She feared he might not remember her, or worse, that he might hang up. But then he spoke, and his voice was filled not with surprise, but with a warm, grave concern that almost broke her. Elena, I was wondering when you might call. I heard what happened to your father. I am so sorry. That simple expression of kindness, of remembrance, was enough. The dam of her composure broke just a little, and she began to speak, the words tumbling out in a torrent. She told him everything. The restaurant, the humiliation, Julian's threats, and the wild, desperate hope that had taken root in her heart. She told him about Julian's boastful monologue, the details of the corrupt deal he had laid out, as if on a silver platter. Judge Finch listened patiently, his silence a comforting, solid presence on the other end of the line. He didn't interrupt. He let her pour out the years of pain, frustration, and fury. When she was finally finished, her breath coming in ragged gasps, he spoke again, his voice calm and resolute. Where are you, Elena? She told him her address. Stay there. Do not go anywhere. Do not speak to anyone. I will be there in an hour. The line went dead. The finality of his words left no room for argument. For the first time in years, she was not alone. The weight on her shoulders felt infinitesimally lighter. An hour later, a black town car, the kind that usually purred outside the entrance of Aurelia, pulled up in front of her modest building. Judge Alistair Finch emerged, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored overcoat, his silver hair catching the dim glow of the streetlights. He was a figure of power and authority, a living embodiment of the world she had lost, and he had come to her, into her world of exile, to offer his help. The sight of him, standing there on the cracked pavement of her street, was the first true beacon of hope she had seen in a very long time. He followed her up the creaking stairs to her small apartment, his presence seeming to fill the cramped space with a gravitas it had never known. He took in her surroundings with a quick, compassionate glance, his eyes lingering for a moment on the photograph of her father. He didn't comment on the sparseness of her life, but she could see the understanding in his gaze. He sat at her small kitchen table, a giant in a doll's house, and looked at her directly. "Tell me everything again," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Slowly, from the beginning, every detail you can remember about the deal he discussed. For the next hour she did just that. She became the lawyer she once was, her mind sharp and analytical. She recounted Julian's words with near-perfect recall, outlining the structure of the shell corporations, the jurisdictions he mentioned, the specific financial instruments he had boasted about using. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of grim recognition in the judge's eyes. He was not just listening to a story, he was seeing the outlines of a massive, sophisticated criminal enterprise. When she finished, Judge Finch sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him. He always was arrogant, he said, more to himself than to her. But this is reckless. He then looked at her, his expression serious. Elena, what you are describing is a clear violation of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, not to mention multiple counts of wire fraud and money laundering. But accusations from a disbarred lawyer, no matter how brilliant, will be dismissed. We need more than your word. We need irrefutable proof." Then, Elena voiced the question that had been a tiny, persistent whisper in the back of her mind for years, the one loose thread in the tapestry of her ruin. "Judge," she began, her voice hesitant, "my divorce from Julian. I signed the initial papers, but it was right before everything happened. I was in no state to follow up. He was supposed to have his lawyers file the final decree. I never received any confirmation." A new light came into Judge Finch's eyes. It was the keen, calculating look of a master strategist who has just been handed a powerful, unexpected piece on the chessboard. He understood the monumental implication of her words immediately. He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "There is a clerk at the county records office who owes me a favor. He works late." The next 10 minutes were the longest of Elena's life. She watched as the judge spoke in low, coded tones, his gaze fixed on the wall, his expression unreadable. She could hear the faint, tinny sound of the clerk's voice on the other end of the line. She held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Everything hinged on this. This was the long shot, the desperate gambit that could either change everything or be the final, crushing disappointment. Finally, the judge hung up. He placed the phone on the table and looked at her, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Well, Elena," he said, his voice filled with a newfound sense of awe. "It seems that in his infinite arrogance, in his haste to erase you from his life, your husband forgot to complete the most important task of all. The final divorce decree was prepared, but it was never filed with the court. Legally, officially, and in the eyes of the state of New York, you are still Elena Croft. You are still his wife." The words landed in the silent apartment with the force of a tectonic shift. Elena stared at him, her mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. Still his wife. It was not a romantic notion. It was a legal status, a weapon of unimaginable power. It meant that every asset Julian had acquired since their separation, every dollar he had made from his fraudulent schemes, every share in his multi-billion-dollar empire, was marital property. She was not just a victim seeking justice. She was, by law, a partner. She was entitled to half of everything. The very fortune he had built upon her ruin was now, legally, half hers. The irony was so profound, so devastatingly perfect, that she let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. Julian's fatal flaw, his all-consuming hubris, his belief that she was so thoroughly broken that she was no longer a threat, was the very thing that had delivered him into her hands. He hadn't just left the door to his fortress unlocked, he had handed her the master key. Judge Finch leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "This changes the entire game, Elena. This is no longer just about exposing him. This is about leverage. As his wife, you have legal standing. You can demand access to financial records. You can file motions that his lawyers cannot simply dismiss." He was no longer just a mentor. He was a co-conspirator, a general helping her plan the coming campaign. He explained that he would help her assemble a small, discreet legal team, young, hungry lawyers who owed him their careers and who would work pro bono out of loyalty and a thirst for justice. They would work in the shadows, gathering the evidence they needed, piece by painstaking piece. The first step, he explained, would be to file a motion for discovery as part of a formal separation proceeding. It would be a Trojan horse, a seemingly standard marital dispute that would allow them to legally subpoena the very documents that would prove Julian's criminal activities. The boastful conversation at Aurelia was no longer just an insult. It was a roadmap, telling them exactly where to dig. When Judge Finch finally left in the early hours of the morning, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to streak the sky. Elena stood at her window and watched his town car disappear down the street. The city was beginning to wake up, a new day dawning, and for Elena, it felt like the first day of the rest of her life. The fear and despair that had haunted her for years had been burned away, replaced by a cold, exhilarating sense of purpose. She walked back to the table and looked at the leather briefcase, now open and revealing the tools of her trade. She was no longer Elena Vance, the invisible waitress. She was not even just Elena Vance, the disgraced lawyer. She was Elena Croft, a majority stakeholder in a corrupt empire and the sole architect of its impending downfall. She picked up a legal pad and a pen, the familiar weight a comfort in her hand. The hunt had officially begun. Julian had threatened to bury her. He had no idea that she was the one who had just finished digging his grave. All that was left was to convince him to lie down in it. The war room was not a room at all, but the cramped 75 square feet of Elena's living space, transformed by sheer force of will into the command center for a righteous insurrection. The small coffee table, once a solitary island for her meager meals, was now buried under a continent of legal documents, financial reports, and annotated city maps. The air, thick with the scent of brewing coffee and the low hum of overworked laptops, crackled with a focused, intellectual energy that had been absent from her life for far too long. Judge Finch had been true to his word, assembling a small, ferocious team of 2 young lawyers, Maria and Ben, both of whom had been his star pupils, and now worked at a small but aggressive public interest firm. They were brilliant, hungry, and viewed this case not as a job, but as a crusade. They saw in Elena not a disgraced has-been, but a living legend, a general they were honored to serve. Her apartment had become their entire world, a place where day and night bled into one another, marked only by the changing glow of the screens and the steady accumulation of empty coffee mugs. This was the antithesis of Julian's world. No mahogany desks or panoramic city views, only peeling paint, second-hand furniture, and the unshakable conviction that they were on the right side of history. Their strategy was a masterpiece of legal subtlety, an intricate dance designed to look like one thing while being another entirely. On the surface, the initial filing was a standard petition for legal separation, citing irreconcilable differences. It was a document designed to appear mundane, almost pathetic, the last resort of a long-abandoned wife seeking her due. Elena herself drafted the core language, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a muscle memory she thought she had lost. Every word was carefully chosen, every clause meticulously crafted to be a hidden hook. Within the standard requests for asset disclosure, she embedded specific, targeted demands, referencing obscure financial codes and corporate structuring principles that only she and Julian would understand. It was a secret message sent in plain sight, a legal document that doubled as a declaration of war. She was not just asking for a list of his assets, she was asking for the specific transaction logs of the shell corporations he had boasted about at Aurelia, burying the request deep within a subsection on marital property acquired through international ventures. It was a Trojan horse, wheeled up to the gates of Croft Capital, looking harmless, but filled with the soldiers who would bring it all down. The official response from Julian's legal team arrived 3 days later, not as a letter, but as an act of overwhelming force. A courier delivered 12 bankers' boxes to the lobby of Elena's building, a mountain of paper that Ben and Maria had to haul up the 4 flights of stairs. It was a classic stonewalling tactic, a display of brute financial power intended to intimidate and exhaust them. They had technically complied with the request for documents, but they had drowned the relevant information in a sea of utter irrelevance. Inside the boxes were thousands upon thousands of pages of utility bills for subsidiary offices, catering receipts from company events, printer maintenance logs, and 10 years' worth of redacted, useless board meeting minutes. It was a calculated insult, a message from Julian that said, "You want to play? I have more money and more lawyers than you will ever have. Drown in my garbage." For a moment, seeing the sheer volume of paper filling her tiny apartment, a wave of weariness washed over Elena. He was trying to bury her, just as he had promised, but this time he was using paper instead of lies. The sheer, arrogant contempt of the gesture was staggering. But Julian, in his hubris, had once again made a critical miscalculation. He assumed he was fighting a small, underfunded legal team. He was not. He was fighting Elena. She had spent the best years of her life in rooms just like this, sifting through mountains of discovery documents, trained to find the single, misplaced comma in a 1,000-page contract that could unravel an entire deal. This was not a punishment for her. This was her natural habitat. For the next 72 hours, the apartment became a silent testament to methodical obsession. Fueled by coffee and a cold, burning rage, she and her team worked in shifts, their world shrinking to the black and white text on the pages before them. Elena's mind was a fine-toothed sieve, catching details others would miss. She saw patterns in the redactions, noted the specific dates that were most heavily censored, and cross-referenced catering receipts with Julian's travel logs, which she knew by heart from their time together. She was not just reading the documents, she was reading the empty spaces between the words, interpreting the shadows, searching for the ghost of the truth that Julian's lawyers had tried so hard to exorcise from the record. The work was grueling, a slow, painstaking process of assembling a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. Ben would fall asleep at the table, his cheek pressed against a thick binder of financial statements, and Maria would gently place a blanket over his shoulders before taking his place. Elena did not seem to sleep at all. She moved like a phantom through the apartment, her mind constantly working, connecting a name on a guest list from a party 5 years ago to a redacted signature on a wire transfer request. The image of her father was a constant, silent presence in the room. Whenever her eyes would burn from exhaustion or her spirit would flag under the weight of the task, she would see his face, not as the vibrant judge he once was, but the frail, silent man in the hospital bed. That image was the fuel that burned away her fatigue. This was not just about justice anymore. Every page she turned, every clue she uncovered, was a small act of reclamation, a blow struck for the man whose voice had been stolen from him by the stress of Julian's betrayal. After 4 days of relentless digging, they found it. It was not a smoking gun, but a single anomalous thread, tucked away in a miscellaneous expense report from the Zurich office, an addendum that had clearly been overlooked by the junior associate tasked with redacting the files, was a line item for a quote, consulting fee. It was a payment of $2 million made out to an entity she had never heard of, Nightingale Holdings, LLC. The name struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a random corporate designation, Nightingale. It was Julian's pet name for her when they had first met, a reference to her love of classic poetry and her quiet, observant nature. He had called her his nightingale, the one who saw the truth in the dark. The cruelty of it, the sheer, twisted sentimentality of him naming his criminal slush fund after the affectionate name he had given the woman he would later destroy, was breathtaking. He was not just a criminal, he was a sadist, a man who took pleasure in corrupting every good and beautiful thing he had ever touched. That single name changed everything. It was the key, the Rosetta Stone that would allow them to decipher the rest of his corrupt language. Nightingale Holdings was not mentioned anywhere else in the 12 boxes of documents. It was a ghost. This meant it was an off-books entity, likely registered in a jurisdiction with impenetrable corporate secrecy laws, a black box designed to make money disappear. A direct legal assault on it would be useless. It would take years to pierce the corporate veil of a Cayman Islands or a Panamanian shell company. They needed another way in. They needed a human source, an insider who could tell them what the paper trail could not. Elena closed her eyes, forcing herself to walk back through the halls of her memory, back to the early days of Croft Capital, before the corruption had fully taken root. She was searching for a face, for someone who had been there, someone who had seen how the machine was built, and more importantly, someone who had a reason to be loyal to her, not to Julian. Her mind settled on a name, David Chen. He had been a junior accountant back then, a quiet, intensely meticulous young man who was brilliant with numbers but terrified of corporate politics. Elena remembered a specific incident vividly. Julian had wanted to fire David for catching a multi-million-dollar accounting error that was, in fact, Julian's first attempt at skimming profits. Julian had been furious at being caught, even by his own staff. Elena had intervened, defending David, praising his diligence, and convincing Julian that firing the one honest accountant on his staff would be a foolish, short-sighted move. She had saved David's job, and in doing so, had earned his silent, unwavering loyalty. She knew he was still at the company, now a senior figure in the finance department. He was their only hope. But contacting him was a monumental risk. She would be asking him to betray the man who signed his paychecks, to commit an act of corporate espionage that could not only cost him his career, but could potentially land him in jail. The weight of that decision settled heavily upon her. She found a sterile, anonymous payphone in a bodega several blocks from her apartment, the cold plastic receiver feeling like a relic from another era. Using a prepaid burner phone was a risk. A payphone was untraceable. She dialed the direct line to David's desk, a number she still remembered, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He answered on the second ring, his voice exactly as she remembered it, quiet and precise. David Chen speaking. She took a deep breath. "David," she said, her own voice low and urgent. "It's Elena Vance." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, stunned silence. For a terrible moment, she thought he had hung up. But then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Elena, I thought... They said you left the country." His voice was filled with a mixture of shock and something else, a deep, unresolved guilt. He, like everyone else, had been forced to stand by and watch as Julian destroyed her. "I need your help, David," she said, cutting straight to the point. "And I know the risk I'm asking you to take." Their meeting was arranged with the paranoia of a spy movie. They met 2 nights later, at midnight, on a deserted ferry terminal on the far west side of Manhattan. The air was cold and damp, smelling of salt and river water, the distant lights of New Jersey, a glittering smear across the black water. He arrived looking terrified, his shoulders hunched inside his trench coat, his eyes darting nervously into the shadows. He looked older, the lines of stress etched around his eyes, a man who had spent a decade working inside a gilded cage. He clutched a worn leather briefcase to his chest, as if it were a life preserver. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You shouldn't have called me, Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "He has eyes everywhere. If they find out I met with you..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what Julian was capable of. Elena met his frightened gaze with a look of calm, steady resolve. "I wouldn't have called if it wasn't a matter of life and death, David. Not just for me, for my father." She told him everything, her voice a low, steady murmur against the backdrop of the lapping water. She told him about the restaurant, about the revelation of their marriage, and about the single, cryptic name they had found, Nightingale Holdings. As she spoke the name, she saw a flicker of recognition in David's eyes, a sudden tensing of his jaw. He knew. He had seen the ghost in the machine. He looked out at the dark water for a long moment, a silent battle raging within him. He was a man of caution, a man who had built his life on avoiding risks. But he was also a man of honor. He remembered the young, principled lawyer who had stood up for him when no one else would. He remembered the creeping rot of corruption that had slowly consumed the company he had once been proud to work for. Finally, he turned back to her, his decision made. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice no longer trembling, but filled with a quiet, sad resignation. "I always knew." He placed his briefcase on a cold metal bench and clicked it open. He had not brought a trove of documents. He knew better than to remove physical files from the office. Instead, he had brought a single, encrypted USB drive. "Everything you need is on here," he said, his voice low. "Nightingale isn't just a slush fund. It's the engine of the entire company. It's where he funnels the initial capital for his hostile takeovers, using untraceable funds to manipulate stock prices before the official bid. It's how he pays off regulators and silences journalists. The money in that account is the seed from which his entire empire has grown, and every single dollar in it is dirty." He explained that he had spent years quietly and carefully documenting the transactions, creating his own secret ledger, a shadow account of Julian's crimes. He had done it as an insurance policy, a desperate hope that one day, the truth might matter. He handed the small plastic drive to Elena. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, the weight of one man's courage and another man's sins. Back in the apartment, the atmosphere was electric. Ben, a prodigy in digital forensics, worked for hours to break the sophisticated encryption on the drive. When he finally succeeded, the contents that spilled onto the screen were more damning than any of them could have possibly imagined. It was all there, a complete, meticulously detailed record of every illegal transaction, every bribe, every act of market manipulation, all flowing through Nightingale Holdings. The drive contained scanned wire transfer receipts, coded emails from Julian authorizing the payments, and secret audio recordings David had made of Julian instructing him to make the numbers work. It was a complete and irrefutable confession. They had the smoking gun. In fact, they had an entire arsenal. The evidence was so overwhelming, so comprehensive, that it would not only destroy Julian's company and result in his arrest, but it would also implicate several high-ranking officials and Wall Street power players. They had pulled on a single thread and had unraveled a massive criminal conspiracy. As they began to organize the evidence, preparing the legal filings that would detonate this bomb in the center of Julian's world, a news alert flashed across Maria's computer screen. It was a press release from Croft Capital. A triumphant, smiling picture of Julian filled the screen, announcing that the company was fast-tracking its initial public offering. The IPO was scheduled to take place in 2 weeks, coinciding with the annual shareholders' meeting. Elena understood the strategy immediately. Going public would create an infusion of legitimate capital that would be nearly impossible to trace, effectively laundering the dirty money from Nightingale on a massive global scale. It would also give Julian an army of public shareholders to hide behind, making any legal challenge infinitely more complex. He was trying to escape, to encase his criminal enterprise in a veneer of public legitimacy before she could expose him. They were no longer just fighting for justice, they were in a race against time. The final piece of the plan clicked into place with a cold, terrifying clarity. A courtroom battle would take too long. The SEC would move at a glacial pace. They had to stop the IPO before it happened. The shareholders' meeting was their only chance. It was the one place where Julian would be at his most confident, his most arrogant, and his most vulnerable. It was his coronation, the moment he would present himself to the world as a visionary captain of industry. Elena looked at her team, their faces pale but resolute in the glow of the computer screens. "He wants a public stage," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute certainty. "So we'll give him one. But it's not going to be his coronation. It's going to be his execution." The plan was no longer just to file a lawsuit. It was to stage a public coup, using her legal standing as his wife, which gave her an undeniable claim to a massive portion of his shares. She would not just attend the meeting. She would address it. The stage was set. The evidence was compiled. The hunter was now ready to walk into the lion's den, not as prey, but as the executioner. The grand ballroom of the Hilton Midtown was a universe of polished steel and deep blue light, a cathedral built to the god of capital. Hundreds of shareholders, analysts, and journalists filled the tiered seating, their faces upturned and bathed in the glow of the massive LED screens that flanked the stage. The air hummed with a low, expectant energy, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the quiet, rustling sound of $1,000 suits. This was Julian Croft's coronation, the culmination of a life spent in ruthless pursuit of power, and the atmosphere was one of reverent worship. When Elena entered through a side service door, she was a discordant note in this carefully composed symphony of success. She wore no designer dress, no glittering jewels. Her armor was a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back not in a functional bun, but in a sleek, severe chignon that highlighted the sharp, determined lines of her face. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning made flesh, and as she moved through the shadows at the back of the auditorium, her every step was silent, measured, and final. Her heart was not pounding with fear, but beating with the slow, steady, powerful rhythm of a war drum, each beat a silent promise to the man in the hospital bed miles away. She was not here to plead or to accuse. She was here to collect a debt, and the price was everything he had. On stage, bathed in a brilliant white spotlight that made him look like a modern-day deity, Julian Croft was in his element. He held the crystal obelisk of the CEO of the Year award aloft, a triumphant smile plastered on his face as the room erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. He was a master of performance, his body language, a study in charismatic power. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that washed over the adoring crowd. He spoke of vision, of disruption, of the relentless pursuit of shareholder value. He used words like synergy and paradigm shift with a practiced ease, weaving a narrative of himself as a brilliant, benevolent leader who was not just making money, but shaping the future. He thanked the board, he thanked his executive team, and he spoke of the upcoming IPO as the dawn of a new era for Croft Capital. He was magnificent in his arrogance, a perfect monument to his own lies, completely unaware that his entire world was balanced on the knife's edge of a single, devastating truth. Elena watched him from the darkness, a cold, detached, calm settling over her. She felt no hatred, no anger, only the quiet professional focus of a demolitions expert about to press the button that would bring the entire corrupt edifice crashing down. He was not a man to her anymore. He was a target. As the applause began to swell once more, a signal for Julian to conclude his triumphant speech, Elena began to move. She did not rush. She walked down the central aisle with a deliberate, unhurried pace, her low heels making a soft, rhythmic clicking sound on the polished floor that was, at first, lost in the noise of the crowd. But her presence was a force of nature, a disturbance in the field of the room's energy. Heads began to turn. The applause faltered, then died out in patches as a ripple of confusion spread through the auditorium. Two burly security guards in dark suits moved to intercept her, their faces set in grim, professional lines. But before they could reach her, a figure rose from the front row. It was Judge Alistair Finch. He held up a single, crisp legal document, a court order granting Elena Vance Croft speaking privileges as a majority stakeholder by proxy. He showed it to the head of security, his expression one of unassailable authority. The guards stopped in their tracks, their confusion turning to shock. The silence in the room was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Julian, still on stage, stared down at the approaching figure, his smile frozen on his face, his eyes narrowing with annoyance, then widening with a flicker of dawning, nightmarish recognition. Elena ascended the small set of stairs to the stage, each step an earthquake under Julian's feet. She did not look at him. She walked directly to the secondary lectern, the one reserved for guest speakers, and adjusted the microphone with a calm, practiced hand. The metallic coolness of it grounded her, a familiar tool from a life she was about to reclaim. For a long, agonizing moment, she simply stood there, her gaze sweeping across the sea of silent, staring faces. She could feel the weight of their collective curiosity, their confusion, their suspense. Then, slowly, she turned her head and looked directly at Julian. The man who had faced down corporate raiders and hostile regulators. The man who had never shown a flicker of fear in his life, physically recoiled as if she had struck him. His face, which had been flushed with victory just moments before, turned a ghastly mottled white. The crystal award slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the stage, the sound as loud and shocking as a gunshot in the cavernous silence. He knew. In that single silent gaze, he knew that the ghost he had tried to bury had risen from the grave, and she had come back to drag him down into it with her. When she finally spoke, her voice did not tremble. It was a clear, calm, and resonant tone, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system to fill every corner of the vast hall. It was not the voice of a waitress, nor the voice of a victim. It was the voice of the law, cold, impartial, and absolute. "Good evening," she began, her eyes still locked on Julian's. "Many of you know me as Elena Vance, the woman whose career was destroyed years ago, in a scandal that served as the unfortunate but necessary foundation for the success of Croft Capital." A murmur of shock and recognition rippled through the audience. "What you do not know," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, drawing every person in the room into an intimate, conspiratorial circle, "is that the state of New York and the legal framework that governs this very company knows me by a different name. My name is Elena Croft." She paused, letting the weight of that statement land. On the massive screens behind her, where Julian's smiling face had been, a new image appeared. A scanned, certified copy of their marriage certificate, stark and undeniable in black and white. "In his haste to build his empire," she said, her voice laced with a cold, surgical irony, "my husband, Julian Croft, forgot to finalize our divorce, which makes me, by law, the single largest shareholder in this room." Now the execution began. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. Her words were the blows, and the evidence was the blade. "For the past 2 weeks, my legal team has been analyzing the documents that Mr. Croft was legally compelled to provide me as his wife. We were looking for the truth behind his success. We found it." A new document appeared on the screen, a wire transfer confirmation for $2 million. "We found an entity named Nightingale Holdings, LLC. As she said the name, she saw Julian flinch, a spasm of pure terror crossing his face. "A name my husband once used for me, now repurposed as the name for the illegal off-books slush fund, used to finance every single one of his predatory mergers." The screens began to cycle through the evidence with a relentless, damning rhythm. Scanned emails from Julian authorizing bribes to foreign officials. Encrypted transaction logs showing market manipulation. And then, the final, devastating piece of evidence. "But the corruption did not begin with Nightingale," Elena said, her voice ringing with the authority of a judge passing sentence. "It began with the very crime he framed me for." An audio file began to play, its waveform visible on the screen. It was Julian's voice, captured by David Chen years ago, clear and unmistakable, instructing his accountants to create the very fraudulent scheme that had led to Elena's disbarment. The voice of the man on stage, the CEO of the year, was calmly and methodically plotting the crime that would destroy his wife and build his kingdom. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Julian Croft did not just fall, he imploded. A strangled, inhuman sound escaped his lips, a sound of utter and complete psychic collapse. The carefully constructed mask of the powerful CEO dissolved, revealing the terrified, pathetic man beneath. His legs gave way, and he crumpled to the stage, landing amidst the glittering shards of his broken award. He curled into a fetal position, his hands covering his head as if to ward off the blows of the truth that were raining down upon him. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a child, exposed and broken in front of the entire world. Around the room, the reaction was a tidal wave of chaos. Board members surged to their feet, their faces masks of horror and betrayal. Journalists were shouting into their phones, their fingers flying across keyboards as they scrambled to break the story of the decade. Shareholders were screaming, their life savings and retirement funds evaporating before their very eyes. The entire edifice of Croft Capital, built on a foundation of lies and propped up by Julian's monumental ego, had been brought down by one woman, armed with nothing more than the truth. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. In the chaotic aftermath, as federal agents swarmed the building and a pale, trembling Julian was led away in handcuffs, stripped of his watch, his dignity, and his future, Elena slipped away, her work done. Her first and only stop was the quiet, sterile room at the Mount Sinai long-term care facility. She sat beside her father's bed, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, and took his frail, unmoving hand in hers. She told him everything, her voice a soft, steady murmur, recounting the story not of a victory, but of a promise fulfilled. She told him his name had been cleared, that the man who had wronged them had been brought to justice, that the long, dark night was finally over. He remained still, his eyes closed, as he always was. But then she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure against her palm. His fingers, which had not moved in years, squeezed her hand. She looked at his face and saw a single, perfect tear trace a path through the weathered lines of his cheek. It was more than she had ever hoped for. It was everything. It was the silent, profound acknowledgement of a father's love, a final, beautiful grace note to her painful symphony. 6 months later, the world was a different place. The name Julian Croft was now synonymous with corporate malfeasance, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the globe. The name Elena Vance, however, had been reborn. She had declined the lucrative offers from Wall Street firms that came flooding in, the invitations to join the very world she had just dismantled. Instead, with the substantial assets awarded to her in the dissolution of Julian's empire, she established the Robert Vance Foundation for Corporate Justice, a non-profit legal firm dedicated to defending victims of corporate crime. Her new office was not in a gleaming skyscraper, but in a restored brownstone in Brooklyn. The rooms filled with natural light, the scent of old books, and the quiet, hopeful hum of young lawyers working for a cause they believed in. She had not just reclaimed her old life. She had built a new one, a better one, forged in the fires of her suffering and dedicated to ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she had. Her final victory was not in Julian's downfall, but in her own ascension, not to power, but to purpose. She had found her voice again, and she was now using it to speak for those who had none. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.